Hello, I'm Henry R. Mockingbird, your host with the Attention all stations. Kong is heading west. He's heading to Henry Mockingbird's house. He is heaving mad over his original review. Stand by for further reports. That is all. Wait a minute. He's coming to my house? Let's see. Why is there a T-Rex in my front yard? Okay, do not eat me. Okay? Do not throw me into that T-Rex's mouth. Don't throw, planes or helicopters. Don't hurt me. I was going to re-review your movie anyways. Please. Okay. Thank you. Hello, I'm Henry R. Mockingbird, your host with the mustache. And I am here under protest and under great enthusiasm to announce this is the final installment of the Memory Lane month, where I today will be the eighth wonder of the world himself, King Kong. So, let's swing into Skull Island, shall we? Documentary wildlife filmmaker Carl Denham needs a leading lady for his next big movie, but is having trouble finding one to go on the expedition to his mysterious little island. He goes out searching for one. On his search for one, he finds a beautiful blonde lady named Anne Darrell. Carl talks her into it, and they're off. But nobody knows where they're going. Not even the captain nor the first mate. Once they reach the island, aka Skull Island, covered up by a wall, the natives want Anne as a sacrifice to their god, Kong. But they say, nothing doing. The natives therefore capture Anne. We find out that their god, Kong, is a giant-ass gorilla, which takes Anne Darrell captive off to the jungle. Carl and the first mate / Anne's new love interest, Jack, go after him while fighting dinosaurs. Spoiler alert, I'm going to spoil the ending to King Kong, so if you don't want this film spoiled for you, skip to this time code. Jack and Anne get away from Kong. They head back to Carl and Captain Englehorn. As they get back to safety, only for Kong to go crashing through the village and start a rampage. Kong finally finds them at the beach, where Carl knocks him out cold with a gas bomb. They take him back to civilization, that being New York City, where they put him up as a big show. Kong escapes, grabs Ann Darrell, and climbs the Empire State Building, where airplanes shoot the Donkey Kong barrel tar out of him, where he finally falls down to the streets below, where we get one of the greatest lines in cinema history.
Well, Denham, the airplane's got him. Oh, no. It wasn't the airplanes. It was Beauty killed the beast.
So, what are my thoughts on King Kong 1933, 6 years later? No shock, my opinion has not changed. I still think that this is one of the greatest films ever made. And it's up there with The Wizard of Oz as one of my favorite films ever made. How was I introduced to this masterpiece of cinema? I was introduced to King Kong through the Peter Jackson film, which I begged my mother to take me to see it, but she never allowed me to, because the film was PG-13 and she was very strict when it came to ratings. I was introduced to the original on the Animal Planet TV show Animal Icons, which had a pretty kick-ass theme song. Then I finally saw the original King Kong from 1933 on my iPod Nano. Man, am I ever feeling old just for saying that. Kong was directed by the dynamic duo of Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Shostak, who, in my original review, I compared them to Indiana Jones, which, now that I have more knowledge on that franchise, that's a pretty good comparison to make. But looking back on it now, I think a far better comparison to make with these two is that they're the real-life versions of Carl Denham and Jack Driscoll. These two happen to be fearless to the bone, being World War I veterans, as well as directing wildlife documentaries, including films like Rango, as well as Chan, which happens to have the mother of all close-ups with a close-up of the tiger. And if you happen to be a Marx Brothers fanboy like me, you might be familiar with this elephant stampede as it was used in the Marx Brothers film Duck Soup. While Merian C. Cooper took a lot of influences from various places, one of them was an exploitation film which was infamous for implying that a gorilla made love with an African native and spawned a gorilla-human hybrid. Yeah, even Merian C. Cooper was afraid to admit that this film was an influence. Originally, Merian C. Cooper had the idea to film gorillas and Komodo dragons fighting in Africa. He even planned a whole trip for it. He was going to travel on a boat to the Isles of Komodo and Africa. But because this was the Great Depression and RKO couldn't afford it, mostly because they were facing bankruptcy, Merian C. Cooper ended up getting novelist Edgar Wallace for publicity to write a first draft of the script. Edgar Wallace got a lot of his own novels adapted into movies and wrote the screenplay for the very first sound film version of Sherlock Holmes, The Hounds of Baskerville. He ended up writing the first draft of the script, then titled The Beast. It was very different from the film that it ended up being. Merian C. Cooper thought it was great, but could use some touch-ups. But before Edgar Wallace could do any rewrites, he passed away of pneumonia. Thankfully, his version of the film can be found in the movie's novelization. Taking over for Edgar Wallace was James Creolman, who had already worked with Ernest B. Shostak on The Most Dangerous Game. He did a rewrite of the script called The Eighth Wonder. And then finally, Ernest B. Shostak's wife, Ruth Rose, who had worked with the two on their nature documentaries, ended up doing a rewrite of the script and making the film what it is today. She injected a lot of their own real-life adventures into the script. The film ended up taking many name changes, including The Beast, The Eighth Wonder of the World, Kong to King Kong. Meanwhile, stop-motion animator Willis O'Brien, who before this movie was doing some of the earliest stop-motion shorts, but he didn't rise to fame until The Lost World. At the time, he was working on a film called Creation, which was causing RKO a pretty penny. Merian C. Cooper convinced him to stop working on the film.
There's a good reason.
Because Merian C. Cooper saw the test footage for Creation and got an idea. A wonderful idea. A wonderful good idea to convince RKO that a film this ambitious could work. They needed a visual, so he got Willis O'Brien, as well as two of the cast members from The Most Dangerous Game, including Robert Armstrong, as well as Fay Wray, to do a test. Test included the Styracosaurus attacking the sailors, to Kong attacking the sailors on the log, to King Kong fighting the T-Rex, and spliced in with footage from Creation that Willis O'Brien made. When RKO finally saw the test, they were impressed. So much so that at the time, studio head David O. Selznick finally greenlit the film. When the movie finally released in 1933, it was a success, getting great reviews and spawning a sequel, Son of Kong, two crossovers with Godzilla, a remake in 1976, which I'll be getting to another time, and that remake spawned a sequel, which was horrendous, and a 2005 remake directed by Peter Jackson. Now let's talk about the characters, starting with Carl Denham, played by Robert Armstrong. In my OG review, I said he was a leader, even more so than Jack Driscoll. But now looking back, that is completely inaccurate. He's not a leader. In fact, he's the exact opposite. He's quite irresponsible. Outside of being an adventure-starved filmmaker who is willing to take a risk, he's also pretty naive. The best way to describe Carl Denham is that he's like a horse with blinders. All that horse sees is the feed. The same thing goes for Carl Denham. Even though he cares for the safety of others, he's so blinded because of how naive he is. He's such a dreamer that when he gets to the island, he finds out about the sacrifices. So what does he do? He grabs out his camera and films them front and center, when any normal human being would have attempted to go to the other side of the island. Keep in mind, Carl was already aware that this island is dangerous. Yet when he goes looking for Kong with the rest of the crew and he sees a dinosaur, all he can think is, boy, I wish I could take one of these back. By the time he captures Kong and takes him back to civilization, he's already gone off the rails. And when he sees Kong's dead body, he takes sympathy on the creature and realizes that his actions have consequences and that he was wrong. Next up, there's Jack Driscoll, who is a salty sailor with a heart of gold, and who is immediately forgotten how to talk to women. He's a good man, willing to prove himself. While the romance between Anne and Jack is nothing groundbreaking, they're still a sweet couple, especially when you take into consideration that they're pretty similar to Ernest B. Shostak and Ruth Rose's romance, especially given the fact that they both fell in love on a ship. Jack is always willing to risk his own life, whether it's on the wet sea or it's on dry land. Next up, let's talk about Ann Darrell, played by the beautiful Fay Wray. Anne is a woman who is struck by hard times, but when she's offered the role of a lifetime, she hops aboard the opportunity, not knowing what she's in store for. She's also rather fearless, despite her mostly being a damsel in distress, often having to be saved, as well as being held hostage by a giant gorilla. She's young, she's innocent, and naive. As for her screaming, I'll talk about that later. Here's a pointless HM fun fact for you. Did you know that Robert Redskin was married to Fay Wray, who did the screenplay for It Happened One Night? I got to meet their daughter, Victoria Redskin, who also wrote their memoir. Check it out, link in the description. Even more minor characters like Captain Englehorn, who's always loyal to Carl Denham despite all the crap he puts him through, as well as Charlie the chef, who's practically an Asian stereotype. But I was flabbergasted to find out that this character was even in the Peter Jackson film. I also find it funny how Charlie's the first one to discover that Anne is gone. That is some really good representation there. I also hate how he isn't allowed to go on the island, despite him being the first person to find out that Anne is gone. Thankfully, they rectified that in the sequel. Let's talk about the eighth wonder of the world himself. King Kong, who is really scary from a distance. Whenever they have to use his face close up, he's kinda goofy looking. But he has a great design, while having some great action scenes, like Kong throwing sailors off a log, or the iconic sequence where King Kong battles the T-Rex, and it is awesome! And quite gory for 1933 standards, given how he snaps his jaw open. Jeez Louise. Kong also has a fight with which I thought was a snake for the longest time, but then discovered it was a sea serpent. You could actually see its fins. Kong most certainly lives up to his name of being a giant monster, as he mows down through a village, nearly stepping on a baby who is thankfully saved, and attacking villagers. I also like how the way he kills people, he just puts them in his mouth and he just stabs them with his teeth. He also steps on people and crushes people to death. Because Kong is such a menace, destroying everything in his wake, he's not really sympathetic until the end of the movie. And I think the reason why he's such a tragic character is that he's just a confused animal who wants love, but all he gets is fear. And unlike the 76 film or the 2005 film where he has someone who understands him, Nobody understands him, not even the woman who he loves, but she doesn't love him in return, and she shows no empathy or sympathy for him. And all of this is beautifully conveyed through Willis O'Brien's amazing effects. The effects for King Kong and the dinosaurs as well was brought to life using the process of stop motion animation, using a life-size hand and making a life-size miniature, making a life-size face for close-ups that they also build by hand, and even used it for the promotion, something that the Lost World did earlier, as well as making life-size feet. They also put the actors on top of the backgrounds, using an invention called the optical printer, which takes two separate pieces of footage, filmed separately, and puts them together into one piece of footage. Optical effects pioneer Linwood G. Dunn talks about his experiences working on King Kong on the show Movie Magic.
I did the optical printing for the studio, and so when I walked in on their stage one day and saw them trying to put shots together in a more difficult way than they could on an optical printer, and I then said, look, you shoot those things separately and I'll put them together, and if you want to change the contrast or make it lighter or darker, I just run them through again.
The team tried filming actors frame for frame in the background while they animated the creatures around them. Not to brag, folks, but this effect is pretty easy to do today. Heck, I'm going to boast a little bit myself. I did this effect in my Goonies review. Or having the actors react to projected footage on a screen, and it blends really seamlessly, for the most part at least. There are times where you can tell that they're standing in front of a rear projection screen, and this is nothing new given how actors nowadays have the volume, where they react to already filmed footage all the time. And speaking of that, this was done long before CGI was a thing, so they had nothing to react to. Nowadays, that's pretty much a walk in the park for most actors. But for these guys, it was new territory. There are times where you could tell that their reactions are so over the top because of the faces they make. They even turn around while they're running. The stop motion effects on these creatures look so fan-freaking-tastic, like Kong's fur or the scales on the dinosaurs. There's even little details you might miss, like the T-Rex turning his head and scratching the side of his head. That's just a little detail. They didn't need to add it, but they did, as well as adding T-Rex gore from his mouth. Ugh. Coming up next are the deleted scenes, with the big one being the spider pit scene, which sadly only exists via drawings and still images. But it was in the Peter Jackson film. And speaking of Peter Jackson, he recreated the film for the 2005 DVD release, using modern-day special effects mixed with the old ones. So we have some idea of what the scene could have been. There's spiders, lizards, and giant enemy crab.
Giant enemy crab. Giant enemy crab. Attack its weak point for massive damage. Giant crab. Enemy crab. Giant crab. Enemy crab.
A tentacle monster attacks this guy. Well, at least those tentacles aren't from Japan. But joking aside, this deleted scene and the deleted scene that comes before that answers some very needed questions. Like, whenever Kong attacks the sailors on the log, why don't they go on the other side? Well, that's pretty easy to answer. Because the Styracosaurus is on the other side and they're cornered. Or how about the fact that where did this lizard come from? Well, the deleted scene answers it for you. It was climbing up already. Yeah, originally the Styracosaurus was going to attack the sailors once they got away from the Brontosaurus. Unfortunately, this scene does not exist. It only exists in stills and doesn't exist in the final film. But the Styracosaurus would get his time in the spotlight as he appeared in the sequel, the comic adaptation, as well as appearing in the extended cut of the Peter Jackson film. Sadly, the less could be said about the Arsenal-Ethereum, which, while a puppet was made, it was never filmed. And an Arsenal-Ethereum is a descendant of a rhino with two horns. Well, I'll give the Arsenal-Ethereum, at least he looks better than the rhino from Kraven the Hunter. And there was even a deleted scene where Kong falls off the Empire State Building with an overhead shot, which again was used in the Peter Jackson film. Music was done by Max Steiner, who also did the music for films like Casablanca, as well as Gone with the Wind. And this was one of the earliest movies to have a soundtrack, and it works on many different levels. It can go from being big and bombastic to it going from mysterious, from it sounding theatrical, from it sounding really sad and depressing and pulling at your heartstrings. Are there any issues with this movie? Well, there are a couple. When this film re-released in 1939, the Hays office, as usual, had to stick their nose in where it didn't belong and trim out scenes, like Kong mistaking another woman for Anne and throwing her down into the streets below. Or when Kong is tearing apart pieces of Anne's clothing, even though he's just acting like a curious animal. These scenes would later find their way back when the film re-released in the 60s. Another issue I have with this film is the criticism of Anne screaming her head off gets old. Well, what are you expecting? She's been kidnapped by natives who she has witnessed with her very own eyes what they do to those who they sacrifice, as well as being attacked by dinosaurs, being held hostage by a giant gorilla, and getting kidnapped more times than Princess Peach by dinosaurs. If you were in her place, you would be screaming your head off too. Other problems I have with this film are more so nitpicks, like how Kong is portrayed very aggressively like a monster. This is mostly due to the belief that back then gorillas were seen as killers, to the point where this stereotype has a TV tropes page. In reality, gorillas are very peaceful creatures. And another issue is when the Brontosaurus picks up a guy and it's implied that he eats this dude, which I'm no paleontologist, but I'm pretty sure it's common knowledge that brontosauruses are leaf eaters. They're vegetarians. They don't eat meat. But none of these problems affect the viewing experience for me. If you haven't seen King Kong 1933, I highly suggest that you do so. It is a classic for a good reason. And if you have seen the film, rewatch it again as many times as you can. I give this film 5 gold stars. Well, that was my re-review of King Kong. Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to see if the king himself has departed. Shh. He's gone. I'm Henry R. Mockingbird, your host with the mustache, signing off. And by the way, see you in the next review.